The presence of hair serves several functions, whether to protect the animal from wounds or bites, heat, cold, or UV radiation. Also, in some specific examples, hair serves other functions, as in communication with a skunk, as a form of camouflage with a meerkat, or as a modified form of protection, as you can see with the modified hairs, the spines, in things like hedgehogs. Hairs form initially as an epidermal thickening that push down into the dermis itself, forming what's called a follicle. Underneath the follicle is the papilla, which richly supplies the growing hair with a very good blood supply. And the hair itself, known as the shaft, is actually made up of dead, keratinized epithelial tissue. Each hair has its own sebaceous or oil gland, which is made up of epithelial tissue. Associated with each hair follicle is a bundle of smooth muscle tissue, the erector pili muscle, and it's the contraction of these particular muscles which causes our hair to become erect. In cross-section, a hair has a central medulla. This is surrounded by a cortex, which is in turn surrounded by a cuticle or cuticular scales. The cuticular scales are often arranged in a very unique pattern, and this is incredibly important for species identification, along with other things such as shape, size, and colour of the medulla. Pigment granules are often found within the medulla or cortex, but never within the cuticular scales. Mammalian hair is typically made up of one of two types of pigment, either eumelanin, which accounts for browns and blacks, or pheomelanin, which accounts for yellows and reds. Agouti is a particular type of coloration characterized by black tips with then successive bands of pheomelanin and eumelanin. So having already looked at different hairs, we'll now take a more in-depth look at particular species and their types of hair. Depending on its mode of growth, hair is broken down into either being definitive or angora. Whereas definitive hair typically grows and then at some point stops growing, angora, such as human hair, will very often grow throughout an organism's life. Alternatively, you can distinguish hair in terms of its basic anatomy, and these can be broken down roughly into vibrissae, underhair, and guard hairs. Vibrissae are typically long, stiff hairs which serve as tactile receptors. These whiskers, these vibrissae, are very often found around the mouth region, as you can see in dogs, and also as the skunk hair. However, you do find vibrissae across different parts of the body in different species. So things like rock hyrax have vibrissae all around their bodies, which allows them to wedge themselves in securely into rocky outcrops. Alternatively, things like some of the crevice roosting bat species will often have vibrissae around their rump region. Guard hairs serve primarily for protection and can be broken down into spines, bristles, and awns. So the first type, spines, are enlarged, stiffened guard hairs. They show definitive growth and are typically found in groups of animals such as the porcupines and hedgehogs. You can see very easily how these are protective. In some groups, such as the New World porcupines, they'll even have barbed tips, which when attacked by a predator will embed themselves and not work themselves loose. The next type of guard hair is the bristle, which is typically a long, firm hair. Now, these are often found in species such as lions in their manes and horses, as you can see here, in their tails. They're characterized by extended angora growth. Awns are the most common type of guard hair and would typically be the hair that you see covering a mammal. They show a definitive growth formation. Wool is a type of angora underhair and is characterized as being soft, long and curly. Very easily you can see wool in sheep. Here's a meerkat. When looking at a typical mammal's pelage, such as the meerkat here, you can see that as you move the awns or the guard hairs, you can see underneath this much denser, softer layer of underhairs. You can also see with a skunk that as you move aside this layer of guard hairs, you can see a denser, thicker layer of fur, which is the underhair beneath. The final type of underhair is veli, which is short and fine in appearance and often very, very velvety. Some types of underhair can be so incredibly dense that it actually forms a protective watertight layer. Angora hair typically grows throughout an animal's life. However, it can be lost sporadically. It can also break off at the tips. In opposition to this, you get definitive hair. Now, definitive hair is lost in a process we call molting. Molting can be continuous, it can be seasonal, or it can be annual. And in some species, such as those found in a temperate or polar region, it can be lost at very specific times of the year, such as in the shed skin and hair of this elephant seal. Some animals will have a total change of hair, and it's very distinctively different between summer and winter, and this is very obvious in something like a mountain hare. Many, but not all mammals, have a very distinct juvenile pelage, and a very good example of this would be something like a tapir. It's safe to say that mammals aren't typically as brightly coloured as many other vertebrates. The integument is very well represented in colours such as greys, blacks, browns and whites, whereas the more vibrant colours such as pinks, blues, bright reds and greens are often much, much rarer. There is a condition called albinism, which is a genetically inherited condition where the body's normal pigment, melanin, is not present. So the pigment that codes for eye colour, hair colour and skin colour is absent, leaving often a pale or even a whitish coloration to the animal. Opposing this is melanism, which again is a genetically inherited trait, often leaving the animal black. The function of colour in hair in mammals can serve one of three purposes, the first of which is for concealment or crypsis. Secondly, it can also serve as a form of communication. So in something like the skunk, where you can see these very distinct black and white lines, it actually acts as a form of warning. Thirdly, it can actually serve to protect the animal from UV radiation through the use of the pigment melanin. Most mammals have a differentiation in terms of their coloration. So on something like the squirrel here, you can see on the ventral side, it's much, much paler than you can see on the dorsal side. Now, this breakup of colour, which is known as countershading, allows things like highlights and shadows to fall on the animal and not be as obvious as it would be potentially in a solidly coloured animal. Some mammals possess conspicuously coloured flags, such as some deer species within their tails and also rabbits within their scuts. This allows the animal to convey very rapid visual signals.